Morning, everybody, and welcome to tonight's George Talk. I'm delighted to introduce you to Bob Ray, who is the ambassador to the United Nations for Canada. He's had a distinguished career in all aspects of politics and diplomacy, and has been inspired by Orwell, as he will now tell you. Over to you, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Quentin. It's an enormous pleasure and indeed an honor to be with all of you today. I have been a lifelong reader and follower and admirer of George Orwell. I can remember buying my first Orwell books when I was in my teens, starting with Animal Farm in 1984. And I was hooked, and I bought every Penguin Red paperback I could find. In fact, I just was looking in my library and I found this one coming up for air, which cost 3 and 6 in 1964. So there you go. And what stood out then for me as it does now are his unique combination of clarity and passion, the fearlessness, and above all the gift of humor and satire. I think I've always thought of Orwell as being an immensely funny writer, and not only in his fiction, but in his all of his nonfiction, all of his commentary, all of his essays. Just a marvelous sense of humor which comes out in everything that he writes. But what I want to talk about today is not only his sense of humor, but also the political perspective that he had. And my argument, which I hope many of you will agree with, is that his perspective is just as important today, if not even more important, as when he began writing over a century ago. I don't have to tell this group that Orwell was born Eric Blair. He was born in India. And I've been following Darcy's wonderful material from there with just tremendous interest. I think he's contributed hugely to our understanding of the Indian background and origins of many of Orwell's ideas. He was the son of a career public servant who also worked in the opium trade in northern India. He was educated at prep schools and even college. As we know, young Blair went to work as a police officer in Burma, returned home, was rejected by the woman that he wanted to marry, we think, resigned his post, and decided to become a writer. He had no money, he had no status, he became more distant from his family, he struggled to find his voice. His was hardly the path of instant success, as some has argued. I saw one critic say that he lived a very comfortable middle-class life. I don't think that would be a very apt description of Orwell's situation for much of his life. In fact, he went from living very close to the margins to living an enormous financially huge success after the publication of Animal Farm and 1984. But of course, because of his very tragic death at the age of 47 in 1946 and 1950, he never lived to see the benefit of that. He assumed his name George Orwell, which is named after the river. And the other significant event, of course, is that he married Eileen O'Shaughnessy in 1936. She was a very strong supporter of George's work and of his life. And while there have been recent attempts to accuse Orwell of misogyny and neglect in the relationship, which frankly I think is a horrible description of what his marriage from anyone else's subjective perspective really looked like, I'm convinced that a more balanced view would recognize that his decision to marry Eileen was as important a decision as any that he made in his life, and that indeed she made a direct and very strong contribution to his writing and political evolution. I think particularly that Animal Farm would not have been the book that it became if it hadn't been for Eileen's very, very direct contribution to the writing of that particular book. In his effort to find his voice, and this is described in many of the books that have been written by Orwell, he decided to basically identify himself with the down and out in Paris and London, the hop pickers in Kent, with people who lived on the margins and faced tremendous struggles and challenges. He then went on to try to connect more with the organized working class and wrote to Wigan Pier. And I think it's fair to say that Orwell, like all of us in life, took time to become himself and to find his own voice. And I think it's my feeling and my sense, and I think it's one, again, that it's shared by many who've written about Orwell, is that it was the war in Spain and his experience in Spain, which he wrote about in Homage to Catalonia, but also wrote about in many other essays and many letters, many book reviews. It was the war in Spain and the evolution of that war and how he ended up finding something and finding something about himself and about his politics that wasn't there before he went there. And I don't think we can understand the later writings, the more famous writings, and what we think of as the Orwellian perspective without really understanding the nature of his experience in Spain. He wanted to join a struggle. He didn't want to just be an observer. He didn't want to just watch. He didn't want to be a journalist. He didn't want to be a war correspondent like Ernest Hemingway and many others who went to Spain to watch and to write about it. He wanted to be involved directly in it and to fight in it. He was told that he would not be welcome in the International Brigade. He had a very difficult meeting with Harry Pollitt in Paris, where Harry Pollitt, where he was not treated particularly well. Pollitt had a very low opinion of him, which he expressed in several of his own reviews of Orwell's works. And when Orwell came to Barcelona, he decided that he would join forces with the POUM, the anarchist brigade fighting group in Catalonia. As Robert Frost would have put it, he took the road less traveled, and that made all the difference. In the opening of Homage Catalonia, which I still reread sometimes, I think it's such a wonderful description of how there are moments in time when political dreams seem possible. He describes the excitement and the bravery, excuse me, for revolutionary Barcelona. But he comes up not only against the evils of fascism, but I would call the devious oppression of Soviet communism. After being shot in the neck and coming very close to losing his life, he met Eileen in Barcelona. And as we'll all know, as he describes so vividly in the book, Eileen came over to whisper to him in a hotel lobby and told him that they were both under surveillance by the Communist Party and they needed to get out. Their lives were at risk. Together with other independent socialists, he was locked up, questioned by agents of the Comintern, but he ended up not being charged in jail, and he managed to get out of Spain, albeit wounded by the bullet shot to his throat and the trauma of losing friends and being chased by Stalinists. It's ironically been said that of those that fought in Spain, that they were, quote, premature anti-fascists, quote. Orwell could be described as that, perhaps, but more importantly, he became a premature anti-communist, if you use the same logic as well. The experience of what totalitarian movements could do, what their dominance in the world meant, shaped his thinking and his writing until his premature death in the winter of 1950. Unlike many on the left, so many on the left who fell under the spell of communism, was once described by a group of people in this group in the 1950s as the god that failed, Orwell received his inoculation in Spain. He never thought that communism was a god. He understood so clearly and was able to demonstrate it so clearly in writing Homage to Catalonia, the use and misuse of language, how propagandists could use words and arguments to distort, lie, and deliberately confuse. Most importantly, he experienced the sheer brutality of tyranny. Friends were tortured and killed because as dissenters from Stalinism, they were classified as, quote, objectively fascist. His experience there put him at odds with the prevailing political correctness of his time. But as the weird alliance of the communists and the Nazis, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was announced in August of 1939, Orwell's insight was proven right. And I think this is one of the most important insights that he had, not unique to him, but one that he was insistent needed to be understood. The totalitarian world was uniting in a display of contempt against national inspirations, against freedom, and against the democratic spirit. For Orwell, the totalitarian world was one where freedom of speech, indeed literature itself, would always be sacrificed to the interests of the state and the party. That was its fundamental inhumanity. That's why he wrote in his essay in 1941, Freedom and Democracy, and I'm quoting here, that any movement that could rally the mass of the English people must have as its keynotes the democratic values, which the doctrinaire Marxist writes off as an illusion or a superstructure. He was as strong a defendant of individual creativity and free speech as can be found anywhere. And that's why even when he joined a political party, which he did when he joined the Independent Labour Party, he was never what I would call a party guy. He was never somebody who wanted to go into politics or become an elected member of parliament or get engaged in the political structure in that way. That was never something that he even considered or thought that he would want to do. Above all, he thought of himself as a humanist, as a writer, as somebody who needed, for whom political passion gave him the reason to write and to express himself as strongly as he did. But when people talk about Orwell's politics or Orwell's political ideas, it would be hard to say, well, his theory of things was this. No, that's not how he thought, and that's not what he was all about. In Visions of a Totalitarian Future, another essay that he wrote in 1942, he wrote very movingly about his experiences in Spain and how they had such a big impact on his politics. This is what he said, and again, I'm quoting it a little bit of length here. In Spain, for the first time, I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, something which I say parenthetically, we all understand happens still today, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been, in fact, no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops had been bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired, hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retelling these lies and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that, in fact, had never happened. I saw, in fact, history being written not in terms of what had happened, but of what ought to have happened, according to party lines. This is, in fact, what led Orwell to his famous remark about his experience in Spain. And again, I'm quoting, the implied objective of this line of thought is a nightmare world in which the leader or some ruling clique controls not only the future, but the past. I think we can see echoes of or portents in 1984 of this. If the leader says of such and such an event, it never happened, well, it never happened. If he says that 2 and 2 are 5, well, 2 and 2 are 5. This prospect frightens me much more than bombs. And after our experiences of the past few years, that is not a frivolous statement. Hence the brilliant satire of the animals taking over Manor Farm and the terror of 1984, the world of lies, of deceit, of history rewritten again and again. A world where privacy is destroyed, tectonic shifts between superpowers armed with weapons of mass destruction and mass surveillance create new alliances that make both freedom and personal life impossible. Orwell wrote 1984 as he was dying of tuberculosis, with the world closing in on him. In one of his poems written in Spain, he described an encounter with a fellow soldier, which George Woodcock, the last words George Woodcock would later make the work of his early work on Orwell. But the thing that I saw in your face, no power can disinherit, no bomb that ever burst shatters the crystal spirit. Coming to work at the UN every day where words are spun and lies abound makes me turn to Orwell, I have to say, for guidance and for wisdom. I'm not saying he was perfect in his stances or his predictions, but as George Orwell has put it as Chris Hitchens has put it in his own inimitable style, Orwell got the big things imperialism, truth, propaganda, surveillance, the ravages of class, freedom, tyranny, Stalinism, democracy. He got these things right. His socialism was always about democracy. It was never about power for power's sake, or even about the success of any particular political party. So if we take, for example, Putin's, quote, special military operation to, as he falsely alleges, to destroy Nazism in Ukraine, is a case in point. History is being rewritten. Facts are being turned on their head. The Chinese government is constantly trying to insert President Xi's thoughts into UN resolutions, compromising and qualifying commitments to human rights, democracy, the rule of law, by making them subject to, and I quote, in the spirit of the equality of nations and mutual respect, which is another way of saying, please stay out of our yard. In 1946, Orwell put it this way. The point is, he said, we are all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue. And then we are finally proved wrong, impudently twisting the facts so to show we were right. Intellectually, it is possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against a solid reality, which is usually on a battlefield. The world that Orwell discovered and described is actually still ours. For example, his personal experience with imperialism in Burma convinced him that the power structure in which he found himself working was in fact beyond redemption. No one can read Killing an Elephant without understanding the personal ordeal that the young Blair went through while serving in the Burma police. While the writer, and her name is also a pen name, Emma Larkin, has described in Finding George Orwell in Burma how the young police officer struggled with the power and authority in his hands, she builds on the later Orwell's assessment of the corruption of power in another marvelous book that she wrote about Burma called No Bad News for the King. These two books I have found invaluable in understanding the current situation in Myanmar, where I've spent many visits in my work on the situation there and also the situation of the Rohingya refugees, as well as conflicts and politics throughout the world. Politics in the English language, one of his greatest essays, should be required reading, in my view, for every diplomat and politician in the world. The mountains of verbiage on display on any given day at the UN and other international meetings are the global platform where the difference between truth and lies is obscured by the sheer volume of propaganda. In her latest book, Autocracy Inc., which I recommend to everybody, Anne Applebaum has described how active cooperation between corrupt autocracies around the world has dramatically increased the threat to global freedom. New technologies, which one professor, Phil Howard, has described as, quote, lying machines, are changing politics in democratic countries as the algorithms of social media leave citizens open to influences whose origins are far from clear or transparent. As we all know, as Mark Twain once said, lies spread far faster than truth. In Animal Farm, Orwell's pigs use their power to benefit themselves, lie systematically, use propaganda techniques, rewrite history, and blur any lines between truth and lies. Orwell's difficulty in getting the book published is a story itself. T.S. Eliot and Victor Gollancz did not agree on very much, but they did agree that in mocking the brutality of Soviet communism, Orwell had, quote, gone too far in telling so many inconvenient truths about an ally in the midst of the Second World War. The UN came into being in 1945. Its charter was a combination of high aspirations for a world where freedom and democracy would find their rightful place, but the nod to national sovereignty meant that the ability to enforce these values would always be limited. And we suffer from this weakness, this fatal flaw in the design of the UN. We suffer from this every day. Compromise required to make the fate of the UN different from the League of Nations ensured that the victorious powers in war would retain control of the world order with vetoes on the Security Council. So we have to say that at the United Nations, all nations are equal, but some nations are more equal than others. As the Cold War began to unfold, it soon became clear that global politics would continue to be more about conflict than about peace. And the United Nations would have to settle for its role as an occasional mediator, a builder of post-imperial development, and a forum whereby people are convened and come together. They don't always agree, and they don't always settle anything, but still, it is better to have these conversations than not to have them. Moving well beyond the satire of Animal Farm and written as he was struggling with TV on the island of Jura and his sanatoria in England and Scotland, 1984 describes a world where democracy and freedom, decency, human rights, personal relationships, a politics based on any kind of solidarity and honesty, have been replaced by the victory of the oppressor, where Big Brother controls people's minds, destroys their privacy, uses technology and a reign of oppression and fear to make totalitarianism complete. Winston Smith, a functionary in the Ministry of Truth, whose job is to keep history up to date by constantly rewriting it, breaks every rule by falling in love with Julia. They are forced to pursue their affair furtively, desperately, as they are recruited to join a group determined to fight Big Brother. Both plot lines, the love affair and the political rebellion, end in betrayal and defeat. The affair and the plot are exposed in a confession that echoes the Soviet trials in the 30s. Winston Smith ends up shouting at the big screen that he loves Big Brother. Orwell always insisted that his books were written as a warning and not as a prediction. He has been adopted by people on the right and the left, and by everyone in between. He died firmly committed to democratic socialism and to liberty, equality, and fraternity. Above all, he valued truth. The analyses, studies, and arguments continue about his life. We are all part of what can only now be described as the Orwell industry. It's quite extraordinary how it has grown over the last decades. But they all continue, and they are still happening. And new biographies and new analyses and new studies are being written every day, for the simple reason that actually he speaks to our generation as much as he spoke to his own. He shared many of the prejudices of his time, and he was certainly not perfect. But if I may be permitted to end by quoting a Canadian poet, as Leonard Cohen pointed out, there is a crack in everything, as he says. But then he went on to say, and that's how the light gets in. Well, there you have it. Thank you very much. Great opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was very, very interesting. Who would like to lead off with the first question? Chris.
Yes, thank you, Bob, so much for coming and joining us and speaking today. So you mentioned that you had gone to Burma, and I think you were an envoy for Canada, and it was at the time of the Rohingya crisis, if I remember correctly. And I know that you were reading at least Burmese Days and perhaps other Orwell and Emma Larkin. How did reading Burmese Days specifically, or any other Orwell at that time, change how you approached being an envoy in Burma or the Rohingya crisis, or how you acted and how you functioned there?
Well, I think first of all, I did visit Burma, Myanmar before then, both just before and just after the release of Aung San Suu Kyi. And I wrote about it in a report, which if people are interested can read. It's published by the Government of Canada. So you go on the website of Global Affairs Canada, you can find it. The report is called Tell Them We're Human. And I mean, when you say how did it affect me, I think that some of the lessons that I've learned from Orwell is in the reports that I've written. I wrote another report on the Air India bombing. What I've tried to do throughout my professional work is, and even my political work, I'd say, is really try to listen to people and understand people and identify with people. The tendency for us to put people in categories, for us to, I don't know, describe people, as if they're not real. They don't have a real story. They don't have a real reality to their lives apart from the sort of the positions we try to put them in. That has been a sort of a basic premise of looking at things. To be skeptical of what you're hearing from people, certainly skeptical from what you're hearing from people in power. I had several interviews with generals in Myanmar, which were literally unbelievable. I mean, not to be believed, but fascinating how people try to try to present things, a common feat of bureaucrats even today. But I think your question makes me realize that I could probably spend more time thinking about the answer to your question, and not necessarily out loud, because I think it is a very good one, and it does actually give me more food for thought. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Chris. Felicia Nemo,
Am I unmuted?
you are indeed.
Okay, I had a brief internet failure, so please accept my apology if you've already answered this. But I did hear that you said you thought that politics in the English language should be required reading for all diplomats. In your opinion, how many of the ones you've encountered have actually read it?
Very, very few.
I'm
Very
sorry
few
to say.
very few people have heard of it anymore. And I make a point wherever I go into a new place of work, I always say, I hope you've all read this, because it not only affects your understanding about the political world, but it also helps us deal with another phenomenon which is very deeply entrenched in our working lives, which is that we all say things that don't make any sense. And we try to make them sound much more complicated than they really are. So that I think I'm sure if you remember the essay, Harold Lasky was, at the time when Orwell was writing, was probably the best known and most revered sort of political theorist and figure on the broad left. He was very much a member of the Labour Party in the UK, but abroad. I mean, he was extremely well known. And Orwell just destroys the complexity of his prose in a few very brief sentences. So I've always used that as an example when I'm teaching for my students. I say, you got to read this. A lot of what you're saying is just way over the top and doesn't make sense. But also the way in which we sometimes often use language as a way of obscuring what we're trying to say, and in fact hiding what we're really saying. The Lasky story, if I may just one second, is very interesting, because towards the end of his life, and he died not much difference between when he died and Orwell, but when Harold Lasky, before he died, he went through a god-awful lawsuit where he was accused by the Daily Express of being a revolutionary, and implication being that he was a communist. And he sued, and he was destroyed in cross-examination, because he did in fact think of himself as a revolutionary, but not that kind of revolutionary. And he was trying to lecture the court about what kind of revolutionary he really was. And he got blown out of the water, and he ended his life very unhappy man. But anyway, that's for another story. I'll tell that story in another place. But it was, I think, an example. But I'm just trying to say, I don't think enough people read politics in the English language, because I do think it makes so much sense to help to what's the word, decrypt or unencrypt a lot of the language that we hear.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Bob, because only this week, Richard and our wives went to a new school in Barnsley. We have an award for teachers, and one of the teachers has got the award for teaching Orwell to her pupils this year. It's a school's only 3 years old, and they've just moved into the purpose-built campus that they've got. And asking them and the young pupils that we spoke to get them to read politics in the English language was something that I emphasized to them, because it's spot on, isn't it? There's no other way to describe it. It's so important. So important.
I agree. I really do. I agree very strongly. I mean, I think it's critically important. I mean, here at the UN, we have this bizarrely named group, which includes China, Russia, Iran, Nicaragua, Cuba, all authoritarian countries, every one of them. And their group is called Friends of the United Nations Charter. And whenever they say, in the formality of the UN, sometimes people say we're speaking on behalf of the group of Friends of the United Nations Charter. And I say, well, I'm a good friend of the United Nations Charter. In fact, I know quite a lot about it, but I don't recognize that what you're saying has anything to do with the United Nations Charter. But you gotta see it to believe it. I mean, it's just bizarre.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, that's straight out of Animal Farm, that is.
Yeah, it is, exactly.
Lovely. Thank you for listening, David.
Thank you, Quentin. And thank you also, Bob, for an excellent and very well
You're very black. We can't really see you.
Oh, sorry, I'm in a sort of darkened corner. I have to hide in these places these days.
You don't want anybody to know who you are. I'm
about
afraid
that.
I don't have that luxury, but go ahead.
Bob, so thank you so much for a very well reasoned talk. And I was also almost thrilled to see you holding up one of my favourite Orwell books, the Coming Up for Air, because for me, I think it's that book which starts off Orwell's real fear of the dictators. When he talks about events in Italy, and he talks about the castor oil and the truncheons and the beatings and the imprisonments, etc. And I think it's that book which I think is almost the conversion of Orwell as a writer to one who's going to be a critic of the dictatorships in years to come. I just wonder whether you have sort of stronger thoughts, as strong as thoughts on Coming Up for Air as I do.
I do. I think that the wonderful books that were written by my friend Professor Stansky and about the early Orwell and how Blair became Orwell are great. And I think there's a real need to look at the period after Orwell goes to Spain and comes back, and then look at the writing there, and you can see how it evolves. If you put Coming Up for Air in the context of all that he's writing, you got to remember, he comes back from Spain, and he's shocked by what he sees. He's attacked in the New Statesman. He's lost friends. He's got all kinds of people who disagree with him. He becomes very actively involved as a polemicist, basically. And Coming Up for Air, I think, is a wonderful book. I think it's one of his best novels. I really do. And there's a wonderful bit at the end, a wonderful few lines at the end, where he describes the joys of the English countryside, and then describes how things are not what they were, things are not what they should be, and how the bombs are coming. That I think is what. And I think the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact really set him off again, because he did go through a period when he was very much not a pacifist, but he was not keen on taking big sides. He didn't come out clearly on Munich particularly, but he did certainly come out as the war started, and then Churchill took over. And you get those essays in The Lion and the Unicorn, which express so clearly, and that Peter Stansky's written about recently in his book on Orwell's sort of. But he's a writer that's constantly in evolution. And what I think is most impressive about him is that he was not afraid to change his mind. He had many admirable qualities. His defense of people who he disagreed with, but he didn't think should be pilloried for what they did. His defense of P.G. Wodehouse, which was quite controversial at the time, I think was an expression of that. That's what, in a way, makes, for people who are politically orthodox or politically partisan, would make Orwell so infuriating, because he would say things that were not, didn't fit a party line. But I do think Coming Up for Air is a key book in this transition from from where he was to where as he evolved. I agree with you. That's a very important book.
Yeah, it was a superb novel, and inspired Kevin Carter, I remember, to really research that, and he's now writing a book on that period, and he leads our visits to Marrakesh and Morocco.
Oh, great!
And amazingly, he identified a lot of this research was done during COVID, 21 locations. And when we did the exploratory trip with Kevin and his wife and Rick and our wives, the only one we couldn't physically see was the house they rented, because it had been knocked over about 10 years, 12 years before. But we've identified where it had been. A phenomenal piece of research on his part. John, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. I enjoyed that very much, and I've also read the Anne Applebaum book, and it's excellent. I'd echo that. I just want to ask you a very general question, really, and it's why do you think so many people are willing to believe obvious falsehoods? And one that springs to mind here is Trump's boast of his record attendance at his inauguration. Why do people swallow things where there's clear evidence to the contrary?
Well, I mean, I think I read that quotation from Orwell where he talks about how people seem to have an ability to maintain these crazy ideas in their head, often contradictory, and at the same time in the face of overwhelming evidence. And I think I didn't get into this enough because I didn't have enough time, and I wanted to spare everybody, but the Trump phenomenon is quite an extraordinary one, where you could see how the very idea of truth itself is challenged. And the phrase that people now use is "my truth." This is my truth. And I grew up thinking that no, there's not my truth or your truth. We all have to understand how people can come at a common set of facts with a different set of ideas. But I think this question of the need for us to defend truth, to defend the fact that there are things that either something happened or it didn't happen, and if this happened, then something else didn't happen. And I think one of the features of our current life that Orwell, I think, understood better than anybody in his writing and in what he said and what he stood for, was this simple idea that there's a difference between truth and lies. Now, you have to remember that for somebody in political power, somebody who's trying to seize on to political power, lying is very important to them, because lying and persistently lying and repeating lies over and over and over again is the way it goes. It's the way you keep people believing that something is there when it's not there. And if you have a will to believe it, then you will tend to believe it. There's a lot of psychological studies about this. It's a fascinating field, but right now we're in the middle of it. Is how many people walk around with the strangest ideas in their head that have nothing to do with the facts or with realities. And I think that, I mean, Orwell put it, that's why I think Orwell said this question of lying and rewriting history is even more important than bombs, and which sort of makes you step up, right? You think, oh my goodness, what does that mean? But actually, it's an extremely true statement, and I think that's what made him very, in a sense, depressed about the dangers of politics, because he felt that he could see it developing. And what's, I think, depressing or difficult about our own circumstances is that we now have technologies, and social media and artificial intelligence, which multiply a gazillion fold the untruths which people are only too eager to spread. Plus, the facility with which people can, through Photoshop and imitating your voice and all kinds of things, get you further and further away from what is the truth. But I think that people who are much smarter than I am and have much greater knowledge of psychology and other things would perhaps be able to explain why do people hang on to lies so long even in their own lives. Sometimes it's a matter of it suits their interest, but the other is that it's just something that people have to feel they have to hang on to, because that helps them to define their world in a way that's less challenging or difficult than to deal with the truth.
Thank you very much. Masha.
Mute myself. Yes. Thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to bring up this wonderful title that you quoted, Friends of the UN Charter, and the group of countries which are more appropriately called the new axis of evil, I would think. And Orwell, of course, apart from the 2 years when he was against fighting Hitler, he became very much against pacifism, and he thought that fighting the aggressor, stopping the forces of evil was a must, because otherwise everything will collapse. So my question is, why do you think for so long the Western world put up with the aggression of Russia before the war, and why the help that was rendered to Ukraine once the war started has never been sufficient? The war is in its 3rd year now. I'm sorry for putting you onto this very difficult political arena, but this is the reality of our life today.
It is. Well, first of all, I'm actually, as you know from my Twitter account, I'm a huge supporter of your work. I think your book is brilliant, and I think it's just been a splendid way of pulling together so many important things about Orwell. I think it's been a huge contribution, and I really
thank you very much. I'm very flattered.
No,
thank you.
Don't be flattered. I really mean it. It's a great book, and it's a book that I tell many of my colleagues that they have to read. Your analysis of everything is right. I mean, I think it's taken us too long to wake up. I think part of it, frankly, is money, in the sense that many European countries decided that the best way to treat and to deal with the emerging dictatorship or re-emerging dictatorship in Russia was to engage and to do deals and to invest and buy gas and do all kinds of things, and that was going to produce a more conducive economic and social situation between Russia and other countries. Don't forget, Russia was invited to join the G7. It was the G8 for a while, and I don't think anybody really decided that they needed to take completely seriously what Putin was all about. And so the invasion of Crimea was not taken seriously enough, was not responded to quickly enough. And by that point, too many countries had become too deeply beholden to Russia, and too deeply implicated in that relationship. I think there's a book there. I think there's a real study that needs to be done. And your analysis of the Ukraine situation is absolutely accurate. I do believe that among the leadership of Western countries, there was a complete preoccupation with the risks of deepening the war, of providing Ukraine not only with, as long as it, as long as the expression, as much as you need, as long as it lasts, which kind of implies this thing's going to go on forever, which is wrong. It's now clear that we could have stopped Putin much sooner, much more effectively, much earlier, if we had all agreed that that's what needed to be done. But there were very substantial voices, not only on the political side, but also on the military side, who have been constantly, their constant refrain is that anything that is done that would be effective runs the risk of provoking the Russians to go even further. And I understand that. I think we have to not simply dismiss that argument, but we have to understand that the price for that is being paid by the people of Ukraine, and in fact by the people of the world, because this conflict, as we know, has had disastrous, serious consequences, not only for the Ukrainian people, but for all of our economies, for all of our societies, and it continues to do so. And so it is the strategy that is being pursued is one where we're insufficiently prepared to say it's not just Ukraine shouldn't lose, it's that Ukraine must win. Because Ukraine is not just fighting for itself. Ukraine is fighting for all of us, and Ukraine is fighting for values that are absolutely at the bedrock of what's important in politics today: freedom and an end to aggression and an end to dictatorial interference. These things are very fundamental to not only to the lives of Ukrainians, but to the lives of everyone else. And it's taking us much too long to wake up to this. By the way, don't worry about my being embarrassed, but to speak out. I'm in the 5th year of a 5-year term, so I'll be all right.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
They don't poke the bear bit. Of course, we have in my business, we have suppliers in Finland, and the first time I visited them was at a time when they were debating about whether to join NATO, and they decided not to at that point because of don't poke the bear. Well, they've joined now, and if you like, have listened to the Baltic states, who probably know the situation with Russia as well as anybody does.
That's true, and I have to say that in my own life, my engagement with Baltic countries, which goes back to the 1980s, has helped it to, I guess you'd say, firm up my views. I've spent quite a lot of time visiting in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, and I find that the perspective that people there have is really critically important, because not only because they were caught in the middle of this horrendous conflict between Russia and Germany, and they've seen it all, and there's not much you can tell them about how things should be. They have a very keen-eyed sense of what it's all about, and I think that is, as I say, it's really helped to sort of solidify my feelings on that.
Well,
those sets of issues. Yeah,
they're also very conscious that they have substantial populations of people who Putin would identify as Russian. And part of his philosophy has been we have to defend our people. So he's got a ready-made excuse for going there. And Kazakhstan, for example, has wrestled with the same issue, and progressively people have left Kazakhstan who were of Russian origin over the last 10 years.
That's right. I mean, I think we need to understand that Russia is an empire.
Yeah.
Because of our own focus on on Western empires and their behavior and misbehavior, which is quite appropriate, and certainly Orwell would have thoroughly approved. We haven't tended to really appreciate the extent to which Russia's expansion did not go across oceans; it went across land, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even prior to that time, Russia became an empire. If you go to the Russian Museum in St. Petersburg, you immediately you immediately have to come to terms with. I remember going there many years ago, and looking at these huge tableaus of peace treaties that were being signed with all the Central Asian countries, and the people going down, rivers in vast boats and all this. I said, "Oh, geez, this was this is all about empire. This is just a celebration of this part of Russian history." And if you read Putin's writings itself, he is somebody who has a very, very keen sense of the centrality of Russia's role in the world, and also of when he denies the existence of Ukrainian separation, he says, we're Russia and Ukraine, we're all the same country, we're the same people. There's no difference between us. I always compare that sort of thinking to a really abusive marriage where the husband says, she thinks the way I do, and we're all the same. We're just one big happy family. Yeah. Anybody with a sense of freedom would have a very skeptical view about that kind of logic.
It's a pity Genghis isn't alive to come at him from behind. Chris again.
Yes. I think Orwell, from what I remember, and I know there's people on this call who will correct me if I'm wrong, but my sort of sense is that Orwell was pretty critical of the League of Nations in his time, that he saw that as not effective, that it didn't stop Hitler, it didn't stop Germany annexing the neighbors. I think you've talked on this call, really, it was a great image of like the friends of the UN Charter not being friendly to freedom or democracy at all. But now that you're sort of in your 5th year, as an envoy to the UN, what are the pros and cons in this day and age of an organization like the UN? Like, is there hope that I should still have, that it can solve international problems, or is it only a place for doublespeak? Or can you talk a little bit more about sort of what your opinion?
I think first of all, I haven't looked long and hard. I suppose I should have in preparation for this talk. Orwell would have shared the general skepticism about the League of Nations that was almost universal, even after the 1930s. I don't think anybody thought that that the League of Nations was going to be capable of doing very much. And when it failed on sanctions against the Italians over Ethiopia, that was pretty well. And then don't forget the Russians, the Japanese, the Germans all left the UN, the League of Nations. It was not capable. Where the UN itself is different from the League as well, its rules are different, but it's that it's a huge social and economic development agency that does an incredible amount of work around the world on a whole bunch of issues that people don't spend a lot of time thinking or talking about. But I think almost as soon as the UN was created and the Cold War started, that people realized that a lot of the kind of hopes that people had that, the people who survived World War II would come out and get together and deal with things effectively became less and less real. And Western countries formed NATO, the Soviet Union forced people into the Warsaw Pact, and there we go. But where I think the UN itself is politically, the UN is challenged and I think is troubled. But I do think that the work that the UN does in a whole variety of fields is what makes it different from the League. The League was not able to do that. The International Labour Organization started in 1919, but apart from that, the League really didn't have that capacity and that strength. There is another argument that I've used, I think it's true, and that is that sometimes we blame the UN and the League for for their failures and say, this book, they failed. And you say, yeah, but the failure is not just the UNs or the leagues. The failure is the world's. It's global. It's the global institutions are the product of nation states. Nation states decide whether or not they're going to invest into creating an effective organizations for collective security. And each time in 1919 and 1945, and since each time after that, most countries have said in the end, well, we have to create other ways of protecting our collective security, and not just by giving more power and authority to the UN. The UN is fairly weak, which is why an American ambassador once said, we don't usually blame the New York Knickerbockers when they lose in Madison Square Garden. We don't blame that on Madison Square Garden. So why should we blame our failures in the international arena on the UN? We should blame it on ourselves, because we're the ones who failed. And I think that's true.
Yeah. Thank you. David.
Yes, thanks again, Quentin, for the indulgence of a second point. Do you think we've got to the situation we're in now with Russia and Ukraine because we basically ignored the precedent of history? I mean, the Soviet Union invaded Georgia in about 1927, also invaded Ukraine earlier in 1924, and then knocked off the government in Mongolia in 1929, and then was feeding the Chinese Revolution, sort of Mao and his forces very heavily. And are there parallels between sort of the West almost ignoring Putin in Russia in that kind of in that period after Russia's 8-week flirtation with democracy in the early 2000s?
Totally. Oh yes, I think so. I think collectively we did not credit Putin with believing what he said. I mean, I think the truth of the matter is that Putin had no time for Yeltsin, even though he worked with Yeltsin briefly. But he felt that Yeltsin had given away far too much. He felt that Yeltsin had made some terrible mistakes. He thought Gorbachev had made a huge strategic errors in deciding to go with glasnost and to go with letting the Soviet Union fall apart. And he felt very strongly that his job was to recreate it, to reknit it, to remake it. And that's what he's been doing. You can see it. I think the way we looked at the Chechen conflict, where he was absolutely brutal in destroying thousands, tens of thousands of lives without any hesitation. You wouldn't see any public leader outside Russia saying very much about that. They just say, "Oh, it's an internal matter," and Putin just labeled them all terrorists, and he went after everybody. So yeah, I think we made a big mistake in understanding what he's all about. I think it's not easy dealing with dictators. I'm not suggesting that the answers are easy. We're facing the same thing in other countries. What do we do? How can we be more effective? Whether it's Iran or China, how do we try to affect a better appreciation for human rights and for protecting minorities? These are huge issues in many different parts of the world.
I mean, one of the unifying things about all those countries, you're talking China and Russia in particular, where India to a degree, although maybe not so much under the current regime, are different, is that they are so large, and they've always had one form of dictatorship or another. Russia had a succession of Tsars, followed by the party, followed by Putin. China likewise. That sort of scale, other than in India, has never trusted democracy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that. I mean, I think you're right.
It's not just, it doesn't justify it, but it appears to be the case.
Yeah, I don't think it's just size. I mean, it's also the nature of how power has been wielded in many different societies. But I think we want to avoid the notion that is sometimes I hear quite a lot at New York and the UN, that well, not everybody's ready for democracy, and we shouldn't really worry about that. We've never had, never had. I mean, I think that I think Orwell would have said that the aspiration to be free, and I think this is the meaning of 1984, the aspiration to be free, the aspiration to be creative, the aspiration to have a personality, the aspiration to know, to be able to express your thoughts and your feelings, and to live in an open and democratic place is pretty universal. It's not always, you're not always allowed to express it, but I think the people who are locked in jail in China know they're locked in jail. They're not happy. We shouldn't abandon people to their fate because they live in a society that has never known real democracy. But there have always been people in Chinese history and in Chinese politics who have felt that giving people the right to speak their own minds is critically important. But I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think we do need to understand that we are living in history in real time. It's easier to describe problems than it is always to solve them, but that shouldn't stop us from having the courage to describe them.
No, absolutely not. Felicia Nemo.
Okay, am I unmuted? I do want to say how much I like what you just said about how we shouldn't say some people aren't ready for democracy. And this actually reminds me of an anecdote when I was an undergraduate at Cornell in the 60s, when some very party line leftist was talking about how Africa shouldn't be concerned about democracy. And a student from Ghana, he had this wonderful Oxford accent, which I cannot imitate very well, said something like, "Would you like to live in a country with no free press, no freedom of assembly?" And the guy said no. And he said, "Then why do you have the temerity to suppose that I would?"
Right.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, good point. Very well expressed. I think George would have approved.
Well, I think Bob's talk has raised a discussion which has amply demonstrated that Orwell continues to be relevant in a way that none of his contemporaries have been. If there's one last question, let's have it quickly. Otherwise, let's thank Bob in the normal way. If you could all unmute your computers. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
It remains a great honor to be with you. And I look forward, when I'm freed from the shackles of my work responsibilities, to join you at several of the Society's events. I hope that'll be possible.
So do we. Thanks very much.
Thank you.